I am Dr. Teresa McKenzie, and I am the chair of the Envision Access Conference Committee. I'd like to introduce you to Barb Costa-Spiggs. She will be your moderator for this morning's session. I'm going to turn it over to you, Barb.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to session 1 of day 2 of the 2021 Envision Access Conference, Disability Access in Professional Health Science Education. I'm Barbara Costa-Spiggs, the librarian for Ohio University's Southern Campus, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Your presenter for this session is Adam Crawford. Adam Crawford is an assistant director at Student Life Disability Services at The Ohio State University. Adam has 8 years of experience in the disability resources field. He received his bachelor's in sociology and his master's in student affairs and higher education from Missouri State University. Adam currently serves as the president-elect for OAHEAD, the Ohio affiliate of the Association on Higher Education and Disability. The chat window is open for this session. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window. We will pause a few times during the session to check the chat for questions. Before this session ends, I will add a link to the session survey into the chat. Please take a few minutes to complete this form. Thank you for attending.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you everyone for showing up at this early hour, early for me at least, I can speak for myself, and here to learn a little bit about disability access in health science education. So let's get started. So today what we're going to do is review 4 areas of focus in creating disability access particular to health science education. So this has been kind of a newer area for me. While I have several years of experience in the field, I sort of tangentially or occasionally would work in health sciences, and I would always, for students in the health sciences, that I would always find it kind of like I suddenly was a novice again, right? Like there were things I didn't understand or know. I was tripping over my words. People were telling me terminology that I didn't know what it meant. And so our office recently transitioned to what some call like a college model, where each of us worked with particular colleges on our team. And so I've been working with the College of Nursing a lot more. And so I've been able to build up my efficacy when it comes to health science stuff. So I'm happy to share this information because I know I really could have used it a couple years ago. So our areas of focus are going to be growing your knowledge of the health sciences as a discipline, understanding discipline-specific accommodations, developing effective relationships and processes related to health science education and access, and then identifying areas for collaboration. And then we probably will have time for a Q&A at the end. Feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we will pause occasionally, but we should have a good amount of time towards the end for discussion and questions as well. All right, so our first focus area, growing your knowledge of the health sciences. I think this is really critical, that when you go into a conversation with like a nursing faculty member or the chair of medical education at your school, that you at least have a baseline understanding of kind of how the health sciences work as a discipline, the history, terminology, things like that. And so there's really 2 seminal resources that I'm going to really, really highly recommend for you. If you have read these resources, honestly, you can probably leave the presentation. These resources are much more in-depth and give a lot more information than I'm going to give you in this hour. And so these have been really critical for me, and I highly recommend them. So the first is Equal Access for Students with Disabilities, The Guide for Health Science and Professional Education. This is a book by Lisa Meeks, Neera Jain, and Elisa Laird. And this is actually the 2nd edition, just came out last year. I have the 1st edition, which is also very, very good, but I wanted to share there is a 2nd edition now out. So this really walks through not only kind of disability access and health sciences, but it's sort of written to be very beneficial for health science educators. So the first several chapters deal with what is the ADA? What does it mean to have a disability, right? And so it's a it's not only a great resource for you, but it's a great resource to like share a chapter, right, with someone in your health science college. And then the second resource is from the Association of American Medical Colleges, but I think it has a lot of applicability to a lot of health science fields, which is Accessibility, Inclusion, and Action in Medical Education, Lived Experiences of Learners and Physicians with Disabilities. And I have my copy right here. And so these two really have some great resources, suggestions. The second one is more of like a special edition publication, right? It's not a full-blown book. It's probably, 50, 60 pages, but it has some great resources as well. Some other resources I would recommend if you want to build up your own knowledge. There are discipline-specific organizations that have some great resources. So for me, I've really benefited from the National Organization of Nurses with Disabilities. They have some great educational resources that I've used in working with my nursing faculty. They have a great video that's sort of a mini documentary that's been really educational. Disability services themselves, their professional associations can be great resources. So there's the Association on Higher Education and Disability, or AHED. That's the national org, and then there's local affiliates. So there's Ohio AHED, and then there's also the sort of a separate organization, but definitely the organizations are friends with each other, is the Coalition for Disability Access in Health Science Education, right? So that's a little more tailored to our topic today. And Dr. Lisa Meeks, I know, is one of the sort of founders of that coalition, one of the authors of the previous seminal books I talked about. Also, just doing a little bit of sleuthing on your own college's website. So I, looked at the College of Nursing's website and just scoured it, every single page. I found their student handbook. I read that. And then also staff, like just talking with the course coordinator, talking with an advisor, right, can really help build up your knowledge as well. And then also the other thing I found helpful, particularly when it comes to sort of career options and sort of career levels, is Googling the topic like you're a prospective student, right? There's not a lot of resources out there that like, I'm a disability resource professional and I want to learn more about the health sciences. There are a lot of resources out there on, I'm a student thinking about going into nursing, right? And so if you go with that perspective, you can learn a lot about the different levels of nursing and the different fields and what does it mean to be pre-licensed or post-licensed and what can you do and what kind of education should I get and should I get my BN or RN, or there's sort of a lot of stuff out there. So one of the examples I'm going to give, I'm going to walk through some key terminology that, for the most part, sort of branches all of the health sciences. And certainly there's more terminology when you dig into a particular discipline like nursing. But generally, we see these terminology across all the health sciences. And I think these are really key to understanding sort of as you want to develop your own sort of relationships with health science colleges. So didactic means like lecture, right? A traditional lecture-based curriculum. And that's usually meant in contrast to a lab or in contrast to, like field work, right? So that's helpful to understand. Like people say didactic, they mean more traditional lecture-based kind of curriculum. There's clinicals, sometimes called clerkships, sometimes called rotations, and then sometimes there's a combo like your clinical rotation or your clerkship rotation or your clinical site, right? But basically all these are on-site, supervised, experiential learning in practice, similar to an internship. Preceptor is someone who is the professional supervisor for a student's clinical experience or clinical hours. And then what they do is they precept, right? So that's the act of being a student's preceptor. So essentially they're like an intern supervisor, right? This was definitely what I did not know going in. I was like, what? People keep saying the word preceptor. What is that? It's essentially a supervisor. Intermediaries, this is another one that sort of caught me off guard. So a lot of us may know the term like lab assistant or ADA assistant, and that's essentially what this is. So this is within the context of like a clinical setting. So it's a staff member paired with a disabled student to assist with physical tasks. And just like in a chemistry lab or just like in other settings, they are not to provide any assistance directly related to the clinical skills, right? They're not putting the IV in, right? They're not doing the actual clinical skills, but they may assist with, grabbing a piece of equipment, or they may assist with potentially lifting the patient or adjusting the patient. It depends on whether that's required of the health science professional or not. But yeah, so they're sort of the equivalent of like a lab assistant in a chemistry lab. It's a little more tricky with a lab with an intermediary though, right? Because you're in a health science setting, you're dealing with real patients, right? So the level of clearance and training might be different. Technical standards. So these are, every program should have these, especially the professional level, graduate or professional level. So these are the essential abilities and characteristics required of a student in order to enter a program, continue in a program, and graduate from a program, right? So start to finish, you have these, you should be meeting these technical standards. And usually when a student enters a program, they sign off and they say, I have reviewed these technical standards and I promise that I can meet all of them. Sometimes people, the one that like sort of caveat or tricky thing is, we're not talking about clinical skills, right? Technical standards are not usually, your knowledge of how to put an IV in and your sort of full knowledge of anatomy and sort of all these things, right? That's what you learn in the program, and that's separate, right? That's more the learning outcomes of the curriculum, right? This is stuff like professionalism and being able to communicate and being able to lift a certain amount of weight potentially, or being able to perceive vital signs in some way. And we'll talk a little bit about how technical standards can be written in sort of a more accessible or a more exclusionary way. The next term is OSCE. So this stands for Objective Structured Clinical Exam. So this is an experiential assessment of clinical skills, and it's usually with a standardized patient like an actor. The exception is veterinary medicine. They don't hire actor animals. They just have real animals, but they do just fine. And so it's a standardized patient who, and they go through sort of a mock patient experience. And so that typically involves 3 steps. So the student would review door notes, which is basically like the prompt. It's initial written information that they review, like the sort of mock chart. And then they interact with the patient, and then they write a case note afterwards. Maybe a SOAP note is a common structure. And then finally, licensing or certification or board exams. So these are required for being licensed or certified. They are discipline specific, like in nursing, there's the NCLEX, there's the USMLE, there's lots of other discipline specific ones. And these do matter both with regards to getting accommodations on those tests, but also sometimes the exams happen sort of mid program, and so understanding like pre-licensure versus post-licensure, and that can affect the experiences that the student has in the program. And yeah, so there's still a lot to sort of dig into with a particular program. Yeah, and this is just the surface, right? Like I said, there's lots of other ones, but I think that's a good sort of place to start. Our next focus area is on understanding discipline-specific accommodations. So certainly, students in the health sciences may still need our sort of bread and butter traditional accommodations like extended time on a test, or they might need, to be able to use an audio recorder and lecture, or, something like that. But there are also some accommodations that tend to come up in the health sciences uniquely that I think it's important to understand kind of what those might look like, so that not only you can be prepared, but then also your college can be, your faculty side can be prepared for that conversation, and they're not taken off guard by it. So first, I'm going to talk about different kinds of clinical accommodations. So one, I see, this is probably my most frequent accommodation that I personally deal with for nursing students, which is needing a clinical site commute limit, right? So for some disability related reason, whether that be some sort of effect of surgery, maybe they have narcolepsy, something that's affecting their ability to safely travel a certain distance. And I know at Ohio State, clinical sites are hard to come by, right? And so nursing students can expect to travel longer than 90 minutes for at least one of their clinical experiences. And oftentimes nursing students will get a hotel room overnight and for the place they travel to. And sometimes that's not doable or safe for all students. And so this one I think takes a lot of pre-work before you ever get a request, right? It's having a good relationship with the clinical placement office and sort of buy-in from whoever supervises them, the dean or assistant dean, that how does this accommodation work? How does prioritization work? What's the timing of placing people? And how can we make sure that we're in good faith providing students an opportunity to voice an accommodation need, and then we can communicate, I can communicate that to them in time for them to try to prioritize them and get them a slot that's more local. What happens if there's just no more sites, right, that'll meet this need? How do we handle that? And so those can be good conversations to have. Another one I see is clinical rotation schedule adjustments, right? So maybe they need to not work overnight, or maybe they do need to work overnight, or maybe they need to have certain breaks in the day. They can only work for so many hours sort of in one stretch. And so talking with the clinical placement office and potentially the site supervisor about that. You might have to identify okay, will the student have access to a break room, that sort of thing. Exploring, tardiness or absences or makeup hours. Certainly missing a history lecture is very different from missing a chemistry lab, which is still very different from missing your clinical hours, right? Your clinical rotation hours. And yet we do know students will have medical things come up, and that will happen, right? And so sort of exploring what's the general practice there, what flexibility exists. I've had some students who, we've worked with their faculty to identify, can we sort of over-schedule them for hours, right? If we know that their medical condition is a little bit volatile right now, can we schedule them for, let's say they need to get 60 hours in, can we schedule them for 70? So even if they do miss a day, they're still on track. Or another option would be, can we extend the end date, right? If they have missed a couple times, can they stay at the site a couple weeks longer and get their hours in? So again, it's going to be case by case, but good to at least have those baseline conversations early. Certainly communication access, right? So interpreters or CART, and how does that work in the medical setting? Who's providing them? Do they need special access, special key cards to get in the hospital, all that good stuff? Potentially, a hard of hearing, deaf or hard of hearing student might need a specialized stethoscope, and so helping figure out how to get them that, getting them connected to opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities, for example. I already mentioned intermediaries, right? So again, sort of like I mentioned earlier, there's the training aspect, there's the who's going to supervise aspect, there's the how do we get them access to the building aspect. And then sort of honestly, before all that comes what are they assisting with, and is that going to compromise the patient safety or compromise the essential learning outcomes for the student to be demonstrating that they know clinical skills. We usually see lifting or movement restrictions on a temporary basis. Maybe someone's recovering from surgery. And so again, just sort of being on the same page with your college as far as, how do you communicate that, and when might that cause friction? I think nursing in general has moved in a place where this isn't becoming as much of an issue. It's more of a team sport nowadays. And so I think, if someone temporarily can't lift something, that's sort of seen as okay. That might vary from different, in other disciplines. And then sometimes we see, accommodations needed related to the modality of the feedback. So, if you're getting just verbal feedback sort of in a group setting, sort of right after an experience, that may not work for all students. And so looking at, are there other options? Can they get one-on-one feedback? Can they get feedback in a distraction-reduced environment? Can they get feedback, are they allowed to take notes when they're getting feedback on their experience? Okay. And then there's some other sort of non-clinical accommodations that I think are good to keep in mind. So, some students may need to take a leave of absence because of medical issues. And so really sort of understanding how might that affect their progress in the program. I know a lot of health science programs are sort of have a cohort model or a lockstep model where, if you have to take a semester off, essentially you have to take a year off, right? Because you're then out of sync with the program. And then exploring, if it's general, is there any wiggle room around that? And if not, how do we make that leave of absence sort of the least negative experience we can for the student, right? How can we, offer them an invitation to rejoin when, a year later, or how can we give them resources to sort of stay fresh on the material, between now and then. Sometimes students want to use their extended testing time on OSCEs, and the word exam is in the name, right? But sometimes we see friction here because of the nature of how they're designed. It's often in a group setting, and there's a strict schedule, and so it feels very not. It's not obvious how we can even get them extended time. And again, so this is another one to ideally talk about before you ever have a case, because it sometimes involves some like logistics that are best handled before the semester even begins. But the thing that has proven most helpful here is to understand or make a distinction between the three different sections of the OSCE, right? Remember I talked about the door notes, the patient interaction, and the SOAP notes, or the case notes. And so in my experience, oftentimes students really aren't asking for extended time on the patient interaction. What they're really saying is like, I need more time to prep, right? So they need extended time for their door notes, or potentially they want to be able to listen to the door notes, have an audio, text to speech option, which that's usually very feasible. Or they can't write their SOAP notes fast enough, and so they want to be able to sort of leave and do their SOAP notes on their own. And usually that's okay as well. Again, different OSCEs and different fields are going to have different structures. But again, I think focusing on the different phases of the OSCE and what aspect is the student experiencing a barrier in, and then can extended time or some other accommodation be applied just to that section. Sometimes students will have chemical sensitivities in labs. So for example, if they're taking an anatomy lab, they may have an be allergic to formaldehyde. And sometimes those allergies can be very, very serious. And so, there's a couple of different options there. You might look at an alternative experience like a simulation lab. You might look at like a virtual experience where maybe somebody has an iPad and they're in the room, and maybe the student has the chemical sensitivity is around the, down the hallway, and is able to ask questions and direct their lab assistant, so they can still have the experience. It probably, it depends on the nature of the lab and how effective a iPad would be at sort of really getting in there and observing and experiencing it. But yeah, that is something that can come up. This year, particularly with COVID and students who have high-risk conditions, we've seen an increase in requests for remote participation for clinical experiences. Oftentimes, Ohio State has generally, if a student has a high-risk condition related to COVID, we will approve the student for remote learning, remote participation, and then it's sort of, like all accommodations, there's the caveat of, will this work in this particular class? And so what we're finding is, for the health sciences, particularly the professional level health sciences, it's really almost always not reasonable. It's almost always, you gotta be there. You gotta be there, and you gotta be working with patients, and you gotta be doing the clinical skills. It's hard to do any of that remotely. Not necessarily 100% no, automatic no, right? But it is tricky to find an example. And so instead, usually where we end up going as an alternative is having access to more advanced PPE, right? Depending, and this sort of has shifted over the time as well as PPE becomes less or more available, but just making sure they have all the protective equipment they need, so that they, even if that's more equipment than the typical student, right? But them having what they need to feel safe. And then finally, having assistive tech options or solutions in the lab, whether that's for a low vision student or, again, someone with an allergy and so they can't be in the room. And so, knowing who your lab person is for some lab experiences could be helpful as we, explore those options. All right, so I think I'm going to pause there. We've gone through 2 of our focus areas. I'm just going to pause for a moment and see if we have any questions.
There is a question in the chat,
Great.
and I will go ahead and read that for you. It says, do you provide this type of training for nursing and/or health sciences instructors at your institution? This is such fascinating information. Knowing this could help in working with students with accommodations.
Yes, I do. So, and it's a great suggestion. I encourage you to, for other folks to do it as well. I haven't gone this in depth with them. I plan to, but I have given the basics, right? I've done our like 15-minute 101 presentation, and then I've had opportunity for questions. What I've done more so is less presenting to a group and more so meeting with individuals, right? And sort of these key players, like the people, the staff of the clinical placement office or the assistant dean for undergraduate education, or these sort of key people to make sure we're all on the same page, right? But yeah, that is the eventual goal, is to offer more sort of deep dive health science specific training on access to my faculty.
I have a follow-up question to that one. So you mentioned that you work with clinical sites. Is that what you said? As far as training or clinical site supervisors?
So I'm mostly working with the university side. So I'm working with faculty, I'm working with like course coordinators, and then I think what you heard was I work with the clinical site placement office, so the staff within the college that are managing all the logistics of getting everyone placed. Sometimes they will decide, the clinical placement office will decide to pull both me and the clinical site, preceptor. They may pull both of us in for a conversation because it's sort of a nuanced thing and we need the supervisor's buy-in. But usually I'm not communicating directly with the sites.
Okay, so it's individualized. It's on an individual need, sort of, if you do work with the site. Okay. Are they receptive?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly there are things that are not possible, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I have to say no, or we have to say no, but to quote our ADA coordinator, Scott Lisner, he likes to say, like, I say no when I have to, and I say yes when I can, right? As often as I can, right? So that's sort of my philosophy as well. Like, we try to make it work, we try to find solutions or sort of secondary solutions, and then, there might be a request, if a student, for example, if a student has their leg in a cast and they are supposed to be doing their clinical work. It depends on the site, but some sites you cannot properly sanitize your boot enough and get in your boot and all that stuff to like safely go into the site as a practitioner. And so there's kind of no, when you're butting up against patient safety, there's kind of no ifs, ands, or buts. Like we're not going to compromise patient safety. But we look at other options, right? We look, okay, can we delay your clinical experience? Can we find you a site where it's a less sterile expectation? You know, basically, how do we, you know, if we can't say yes to your initial ask, how do we find the next best option?
Okay, thank you.
There is one more question here from Tyler. Have there been any cases where virtual clinicals have been approved for a student? And if so, were there any issues or accommodations the student experienced?
So to my knowledge, no. I have not worked with a student who needed it for a health-based reason and they were available. And I've only worked with 1 or 2 students in that scenario. One student decided that, you know, when the initial answer was like, you know, there aren't any current experiences available, the student said, you know what, and this was back in the summer, right? So COVID was still fairly new, and the student was like, you know what, I think it may just be best for me to like take a year off. And I was, you know, and I didn't push the student that way. I was like, we can work with you, we can, you know, keep trying. And the student's like, no, I think I want to pause and sort of wait for this COVID thing to get over before I continue. And then the other student, once she was offered additional PPE, she felt much more comfortable with going to clinical. What we did settle on with both of those students was, if a virtual experience does become available, they get priority, right, over other students, so long as it would still meet their, you know, would check the right box for their clinical experience. They would get that opportunity before any other student because they had a health-based reason for it. To my knowledge, it never came up though.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to focus area 3. So all about developing effective relationships and processes. I think for folks who do this work, we know like this is it, this is where it's at, right? To do our jobs effectively, it's all about relationships. It's all about the processes we set up. And so I think that's especially true in the health sciences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the successes I've experienced working with my College of Nursing. But I think these strategies are widely applicable. So, and some of these I've already sort of mentioned and sprinkled throughout my presentation so far. So one is identifying key players in the college, right? I know for me, like, the ratio of number of atom, which is 1, and the number of nursing faculty, that's a wide ratio, right? And so I really need to, you know, sort of efficiently use my time, right? So again, I want to be able to talk to the key players who are making decisions and are sort of managing these requests. And so I've had really good several sit-down conversations with the sort of person who handles accommodations for clinical experiences at the undergrad level. I've had conversations with the person who handles it at the grad level. I've had conversations with the clinical placement office, right? The staff who are doing the logistics. I've had conversations with a couple of assistant deans who are sort of more the curricular-based sort of level. And that has made the experience 10 times better. And I'm talking 6, 8 people, and just having good relationships with those 6 or 8 people has made a world of difference in the wheel spinning and stuff getting done, right? Because they can oftentimes act as the bridge through which my message gets to faculty, right? And faculty, you know, oftentimes before they come to me, they'll come to one of them, right? And they're like, have you seen this on a accommodation letter before? And what am I expected to do? And I don't understand, right? They're going to go internal first before they call me. And so having some key allies in place has been really, really effective. And really that just came about from me contacting them and saying, hey, we've had a shift in how our office works. That actually gets to our next item here, designating an office liaison. You know, I let a few people that I was already aware of in the College of Nursing know, hey, I am now your designated person. I'm kind of your primary point of contact now because we organized by college, which, by the way, faculty love that we did this, right? Because they hate having to work with all of us, right? They love having a single point of contact. It's like, okay, I can like invest in you. I can like teach you about things, and I know it's like worth my investment instead of like me investing all this time and then next time an issue comes up, I'm dealing with another one of you, right? And so that has been really great, just to encourage their buy-in, right? Because half the battle is getting them to want to work with you and want to invest their time. And so by saying, I'm your guy, I'm your liaison, they're much more likely to be like, oh, thank goodness. Okay, let's sit down and let's actually have a proactive conversation, right? And so it's really been great for both parties, honestly. But yeah, honestly, just sitting down and just talking through stuff, right? And sometimes it takes a couple of meetings, but I find that instead of getting a faceless accommodation letter, when they actually can put a face and an understanding and an explanation and a humanity to the process, they're much more sort of open to an accommodation. And I think like, well, they might think like, oh, I'm not quite sure what this accommodation means, but I know Adam, right? And I know he's above board. So okay, I'm not gonna like react. I'm gonna be curious, and I'm gonna like ask questions instead of being like, what is this accommodation on this letter? This is ridiculous. Don't they know what clinical education is, right? These know nothing, right, people? I think by humanizing me and humanizing my office, we humanize the process, and that leads to a better experience. I also would advise you, if you're thinking about this, to really approach it as a partnership. Don't come in and say, this is the things we need to change, this is my agenda. You might have an agenda, you might have things that you think need to improve, but like, save that, right? Save that card. Really go in and say like, I want our units to have a better relationship. What would that mean for you, right? Ask about their concerns, ask about their suggestions, because honestly, I didn't quantify it, right? But like a lot, if not most of the improvements came from the college suggesting things to me and me being like, oh, I didn't know that, or oh, let me explain that, right? And so if I had come in with a script, that may have not been as effective. And so I think really approaching it as a partnership is more of a sustainable way to do it. And I think it's a more effective way to do it. And then, something I think was really effective for me at the beginning was just making sure that me and whoever I was meeting with, make sure we're on the same page about the basics. And that you would be surprised when you have sort of a faceless bureaucratic system, and maybe there's been some tension over the years, right? And there's been turnover, right? And we do things because that's how we do them, and no one can remember why we originally made that decision, and all these factors. You could be amazed at like what basic principle is the like, oh, we're not on the same page about that. No wonder you're frustrated, right? No wonder you're confused because you don't understand where I'm coming from. Okay, hold on, let me zoom out, right? So things like, what is a disability, right? Like what kind of conditions are we talking about here, right? That can be really edifying. What is a reasonable accommodation, right? Like I'm not just willy-nilly making things up, right? I have a process, right? And there is such a thing as an unreasonable or unfeasible, accommodation. What language are we using around accommodations, and when someone's eligible for an accommodation or approved for an accommodation or denied an accommodation, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? One specific example that happened with our sort of undergrad clinical nursing person was the aha moment we had was they were so we have an accommodation called attendance and deadline modifications if a student has an acute episode that flares up and they have to miss class or something, and they thought that all clinical experiences, regardless of what class it was, regardless of what learning outcome it was, regardless of what student it was, and regardless of how long the clinical experience was, right? 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks, they had to give the same amount of flexibility. This 2 days is 2 days is 2 days no matter what. And so explaining like, oh no, the accommodation is based in the curriculum and it's based in the course design. And of course, it might be reasonable to miss more for a 16-week, 3 times a week experience than a 4-week, once a week experience. That's just different, percentages of the experience, and you're probably having completely different learning outcomes in those experiences. And so it's based in the curriculum. It's not a flat number, right? And that was such a aha light bulb moment for them, where they're like, oh, now did our website say that? Yes. Did our letters say that? Yes. But again, the history, right? And the sort of turnover and just kind of some of the bureaucratic stuff lends itself sometimes to misunderstandings that prove persistent misunderstandings. And so I think, again, humanize the process and you can sort of catch those misunderstandings. Doing your homework, right? I think that can be really key, particularly, if you might have, if you're walking into a situation where you suspect you might not be taken seriously because you're not a faculty member. I think having done your homework on some of those key terminologies, right? Understanding what the curriculum is, understanding what the professional, what some acronyms are, can be really helpful in just at least giving yourself that foundational cred of, I know what I'm talking about here, right? Y'all are still the experts in the curriculum, but I'm not clueless, right? I do know some basic stuff. And then I mentioned this before, just honoring patient safety. This, I think, is unique, where this becomes, I'll be generous and I'll say, a good faith reason why we can receive some resistance to accommodations is the fear that it will compromise patient safety. And that is very key and critical to health science professions. And so it's understandable why they honor it so fiercely, right? And I think our job is to echo that commitment, right? That of course we want to honor patient safety, and let's not assume that just because someone has a disability, they're going to compromise patient safety, right? And just because they need a particular accommodation doesn't necessarily mean it's going to compromise patient safety, right? We need to handle this on an individual case-by-case basis. And I would never approve an accommodation in an environment that would compromise patient safety, right? So I'm on your side. Let's not jump to conclusions, right, on patient safety. And I think that has been really key as well. One example is we were having conversations about tardiness and within a clinical setting, and they were talking about how, well, we can't let students show up late because it'll compromise patient safety. You miss the you miss the door notes. You miss the initial setup. And I was like, okay, so there's a zero tolerance policy with absences. Is that correct? Or they're like, oh, no, everyone gets a freebie. I'm like, wait a minute. So everyone can compromise patient safety once? Like you can't compromise 15 other experiences. No, it'll compromise patient safety. But everyone oversleeps. That doesn't make any sense. And they're like, well, okay, let's get more specific. They're like, everyone gets a freebie, but they don't count against their grade. But if they show up so late that they've completely missed the door notes, then we ask them to leave, right? Because they will compromise patient safety, but we don't dock them, right? Everyone gets one freebie as far as the grade. I'm like, okay. So it sounds like it's really not about tardiness. It's being there at 12:20 p.m., right? It doesn't sound like it's about that. It's about, have they missed the door notes? And the exact time of that might vary, but have they missed the door notes and therefore they're not prepared to work with patients? Is that right? And they're like, yes, that probably should be your policy, that if you've missed, you can have additional tardiness, right? If you've got medical issues going on and it may cause you to be tardy more often. Maybe that's the accommodation, but if you've missed door notes, it doesn't matter, right? If you've missed that initial setup around patient safety, doesn't matter. We can't compromise that. So that was one. That's an example. And then our fourth focus area is around identifying areas for collaboration. So the first area I have found to be a good area to work with, collaborate with the College of Nursing is around faculty development. And this is ongoing, right, as I mentioned earlier, but, some topics you might think about including are kind of the 101 stuff, right? So like, what are accommodations? What is inclusive course design? What is access, right, within the educational setting? I think attitudinal barriers and the professional culture within health sciences can be pretty problematic. There's sort of a old school view that is prevalent that we are the healers, right? We don't need healed, right? We are the healers, and if you need healed, i.e., you're disabled, right? You can't be a healer, right? You cannot be in this field. You're the patient, right? Disabled people are patients. They're not the providers, right? And that's baked in a lot of sort of assumptions and sort of cultural norms. And so interrupting that and realizing that there's actually a lot of sort of lived experience that can be really helpful to one's work if one has that lived experience of disability, right? They actually bring things to the table to the field and to their patients, and so sort of reevaluating that. And then similarly, looking at what is the intersection with the health sciences curriculum and disability studies, right? So the study of disability and what are the perspectives of disabled scholars within the health sciences, right? What would some of the models within disability studies, like the social model, what does the social model lens say about how the health sciences is run or taught? And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So the second column is about diversity and inclusion efforts. A lot of the health sciences are trying to pay more attention to this within higher ed. And so I think there's opportunity to include disability in that discussion. So again, when we look at the rhetoric around diversity and inclusion and sort of value statements, if we enumerate identities, are we including disability, right? Are we, because disability is an aspect of human diversity and they are a historically marginalized group. So are we including them in those efforts? Not only in our rhetoric, but in how we educate people, right? And in our presentations and our workshops and our trainings. And then if we're doing, diversity and inclusion related assessment or data collecting, can the Disability Services Office assist with that as far as providing data around disability? Now, of course, we would not provide individual data, right? But aggregate data is certainly possible, right? And so, do they want to track the number of registered students within the college? Do they want to understand any sort of particular aspect of the disability experience? Do they want to survey their students and include disability as sort of an area of interest? And then finally, sort of the policies and procedures area. Always good to look at the accommodation statements that are being used in classes and syllabi or websites or handbooks, particularly around things that are sort of non-didactic, right? Like how are the lab, how are the accommodations, how do the accommodation statements address lab experiences in clinicals? Technical standards, so going back to those, again, those are the non-clinical skill basic essential abilities and attitudes and characteristics. Are those written in what's called an organic way, which basically is based in the body? So you need to be able to listen with your ears to a heartbeat, right? That would be a very organic version of a technical standard versus a functional technical standard says you need to be able to interpret, right? You need to be able to observe and interpret a heartbeat. There is assistive technology that can do that for like a deaf or hard of hearing individual, right? Whereas in the former version, the organic version, a deaf person could not do that, right? But in the functional version, they could. And so I think it's good so that's sort of the terminology that's helpful if you want to approach that conversation. I don't have time to like fully dive into it, but sort of organic technical standards versus functional technical standards, and like, is there a way that we can move more towards a functional model? And then also, are technical standards just like published? Are they available publicly? And is there a statement around disability access and accommodations, right? Sort of similar to admission standards, right? That would say, you know, with or without accommodations, right? Are you able to meet these admission standards? So with or without accommodations, right? And we sort of support the inclusion of people with disabilities using accommodations to meet these technical standards. And then finally, you know, particularly with intermediaries, I think there's some bureaucratic details that, again, are good to work out in advance, particularly with HR. Again, like that probably needs to be a job, right? So a job has to be created. What's the reporting structure? Is it in disability services? Is it in HR? Is it in the College of Nursing? You know, where does it live? What are the job duties? How does it get approved? How do they get trained? How do they get access to a clinical site? I mean, there's a lot there to sort of figure out. And so, you know, do yourself a favor and figure all those logistics out before you even ever have a request for an intermediary, so that when it comes up, you're not scrambling to write a job description and get it approved very, very quickly, right? And hire someone and figure out all those things all at once. All right, so those are my slides. We're at the Q&A portion for the rest of the presentation. I think we have 10 more minutes, so I'm happy to answer any questions. I also have my email here, crawford.843@osu.edu, if we don't get to your question or if you think of something later and want to chat.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I will go ahead with those. The first one is from Marianne, and she asks, do you have an example of a concern about patient safety?
Sure. So, you know, this could come up in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it comes up with like an intermediary where, you know, well, would the intermediary put the patient at risk, right? Because they're not a health professional. You know, and then you have to explain what would the intermediary be doing. This can come up again with like having your arm in a cast and the cast is not sanitized or not able to be properly sanitized. It can come up. It can sometimes come up with schedules, right? Where like, well, would it put a patient's safety at risk if you, sort of like I mentioned, if you arrive late and then you don't have the door notes of the experience you're about to participate in. And so it does come up, but usually we can, the way I like to think about it is like patient safety is a factor that we need to include in our analysis. It is not like a veto card to be like, well, absolutely not, we're not accommodating this student, right? It's like, okay, well, okay, that's a factor we need to bring in and we need to honor it, but like, let's keep going, right? Let's keep brainstorming.
Okay. I think this might be a follow-up. Can you reflect on costs, maybe?
What do you mean by that? The cost? Do you mean like financial costs of an intermediary, or what do you mean?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe whoever typed that, maybe you could expand a little bit, elaborate, and I'll go on to another question while we wait for that. What steps would you recommend for a new college student with a disability when they're considering a health science program?
You know, I think sort of learning more about the profession is always great. I think particularly, you know, it honestly partially depends on the kind of disability they have. If they have a readily obvious disability, so if it's a wheelchair user, blind, low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, they may more readily and obviously face discrimination at the gate. I wish that wasn't so, but I think it's just the nature of, you know, something be readily obvious and visible. And so, you know, I think be prepared for that. Again, I don't like it and I'm trying my best to you know, doing what I can to get rid of that. But I think just being aware of that. And therefore, I think it's helpful to look for examples of trailblazers who have been able to do it, so that you have like, if nothing else, but for yourself to have sort of this North Star of like, I know that this is possible because someone else has done it, right? And I won't let anybody tell me otherwise. I mentioned the oh, I'm forgetting the title, but the Association of Disabled Nurses, whatever that acronym is, that was earlier in my slides. They have this great short documentary about a nursing student who's a wheelchair user, and they interview her, they interview her classmates, they interview her faculty, and you can see the evolution of like how in the beginning, I mean, she did get, she got admitted, but she got resistance from some of her faculty, and they, and the faculty talk about why and how they changed, how she was able to change their minds. And some of it has to do with the history of nursing and not being taken seriously as a profession. So they take themselves very seriously as far as like rigor of the program. They talked about sort of some of the accommodations they were able to figure out for her. And my favorite part was, sort of the student sharing, like, my biggest barrier in this experience is other people's attitudes about me, right? Like, that's my biggest problem. My biggest problem is not that I can't reach a particular thing, right? Or I can't lift a patient. I can figure that out. What my problem is that everyone just keeps assuming that I can't be a nurse, right? That's my biggest issue in this program. And she was able to graduate, and so it's a really great video. And so I guess believing in yourself, right? Believing and having a North Star if you can, and then just knowing what you need, right? Knowing what accommodations you might need in a situation, doing a little homework, if you're not sure, maybe talking to other folks who have had that experience, and then connecting with the disability service office as soon as you can so that we can brainstorm.
We got a little more information on the other questions, so I'll go ahead and read that. So it started, can you reflect on costs, and then goes on to ask about overall budget values, expense average per accommodation, and high cost and low cost accommodations.
Yeah, I don't think I can in the short time. The only thing I will say is that from within the context of higher ed, and I don't think this is what the question is implying, but it does make me think of this answer, which is, the cost of an accommodation is so very rarely a reason to say no. And when the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights looks at a case of discrimination and decides, was this an undue burden on the university to do this from a financial perspective? They don't look at the disability services budget. They don't look at the college nursing budget. They look at the institutional budget, right? And so, if you just renovated that football stadium, or if you, you just had, you just gave away, certain research funds or something like that, internal research funds, if you were able to do those things, you were probably able to provide a sign language interpreter, right? You were probably able to provide an intermediary. And so, so yeah, I mean, certainly some accommodations may cost different amounts, and there's ways to sort of try to plan for that, right? Is there, yeah.
Okay, I just also wanted to mention, I put the link for the survey in the chat, and I will wait another minute or two for more questions. We do have 2 more minutes. Oh, and the person that asked the question said, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
we do have 2 more minutes if anyone's got a final question.
I just want to ask, okay, as an accessibility coordinator, how long ago did you make the change to college-specific like coordinators?
Yeah. We shifted over at the beginning of autumn. Oh, I want to make sure I get this right. I think it's autumn 19. Yeah.
Okay. And it's been well received since you started.
Yes, particularly in the, health sciences, but I would say in general, yeah, I would sort of with the things I mentioned earlier, right? Like professors feeling like they can put a face to an office, sort of course coordinators or deans feeling like, oh, I can finally invest time into you and teach you about my college, and like you have time and energy to like invest back, right? Instead of, previously, which is like I had to work with all colleges and all departments and all majors, and like I can't keep it all in my head, right? Now I get to just focus on these majors, these colleges, and learn more about them. And so yeah, I think certainly, I mean, there's always sort of nuances to it, right? Like, any system can be designed in such a way that like might accidentally end up in bureaucracy that hurts students, right? And so we were very intentional about that. Like, if a student calls our office and gets somebody else on the phone, we're not going to tell them like, well, I'm not the nursing student, so good luck, click, right? Like, we're still going to work with students even if they're not on your caseload, right? Like, there's some norms that you have to establish, but I would say overall it's been a very, very I've been very, very happy with the results.
You may close it out, Barb, or you want to go ahead?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, Teresa, that's fine.
Okay, so thank you, Adam, for doing this. I learned a lot. I have lots of notes. So I appreciate you doing this, and I look forward to seeing this and maybe even more information at our Ohio Ahead conference or ahead. Hint, hint. Again, thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Our next session is at 1 o'clock this afternoon, and we'll see all of you then. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.